So thank you very much, Leo, for the introduction. So I'm glad, I would like to thank you very much. I'm glad that I can present a piece of our works today. So I hope you will find some interesting information in there. And so the whole lecture will be about recrystallization of nickel-based superalloys after forging operations. And this will include experimental assessment of the mechanisms and also their description with numerical models. So actually the numerical part of the work is handled by my colleague Marc Bernacchi. And so I would like to associate him to the presentation. And I would like also to acknowledge many of our PhD students who have contributed to these works and to whom I've taken some illustrations for the lecture. Many of these works have been done also in the frame of industrial chair that is co-funded by the French Agency for Scientific Research, the so-called ANR, and the Safran Group. So this is the reason why you have all these logos down here. All right, so first let's speak a little bit about nickel-based superalloys. Yes, it works. So superalloys are materials with quite exceptional properties. By this, I mean they have been developed for aircraft engines, because in these applications, we need materials able to sustain very high temperatures and also very high loads. Meaning, if you consider a turbine disc onto which the blades are connected, each blade would deliver or is equivalent to up to 22 tons of load. So it's quite a huge stress levels, which are these materials are submitted to. And in addition to this, temperature and stress level is not constant. They are submitted to cyclic loadings. So these materials have to sustain or resist to creep, solicitation, fatigue, but also hot corrosion because of the hot gases which are in there. Over the years, the improvement of these materials have allowed to increase the operating temperatures of the aircraft engines, and with this have allowed actually lowering the decrease of the fuel consumption, and of course with a direct ecological benefit. In addition to this, I would like to emphasize that these materials could nowadays be regarded as materials for past applications. I mean, there is a tendency to be quite critical with regards to aircraft industry, but actually these materials are also used or also allow other applications, notably with regards to alternative energy technologies, such as the example here, which is the solar power plant, in which you have to use materials which are able to resist to molten salt corrosion at high temperatures. And in these applications, nickel-based superalloys are the materials which are necessary also. So they are not only past materials, but very important also for future applications. All right, so now we need to make pieces with these materials, which have extraordinary properties. And so I will go back to the turbine disc application. So for making a turbine disc, the material undergoes a number of thermomechanical processes. I mean, heating, hot forging, or deformation as a general to tell it on a general way, and subsequent heat treatments. During all these steps, the material will undergo a number of metallurgical transformations, microstructure evolutions, and recrystallization phenomena are those by which the grain size can be controlled. In these materials, you can find second phase particles, so large precipitates you can see here, which are used for controlling the grain size by the Smith Zener pinning phenomenon. Because for these properties, for these applications, you have to achieve a given grain size, a targeted grain size, which allows for getting a good compromise between the fatigue and the creep behavior. And therefore, the grain size is typically 10 microns. With a typical 10 micron grain size, you achieve a good compromise between the fatigue and the creep solicitations. After forging operations, then the material has to go through a thermal treatment for dissolving partly the second phase and make it precipitate again and in a controlled manner so that the mechanical behavior can be optimized. But during forging operations, these hardening precipitates are not present, so we just have to deal with the FCC matrix and second phase particles for which interact with grain boundary movements. How do we handle this at the lab scale? So at the lab scale, we will perform thermomechanical tests which mimic the industrial process, where the temperature, strain rate, strain level, holding times, heating, cooling rates can be varied to approach the industrial conditions. Then interrupted tests, the test can be interrupted at different stages, and the microstructure characterized so that the metallurgical mechanisms can be identified as well as their kinetics, which can then be described in different types of models. So I will today illustrate mean field models and full field models. By this, I mean, in a full field model, the microstructure is described statistically, and it evolves using analytical laws, physical laws. So it's kind of a statistical description of the microstructure. And in full field model, we have an explicit representation of the grain structure in a finite element mesh, and the same physical phenomenon can be simulated again. So these phenomena are basically of two types. I mean by this that if you take a polycrystal and start deforming it, of course, energy will be stored in the microstructure in the form of defect, mostly dislocations. And once you reach a critical amount of stored energy or dislocation density, then you would see new grains forming and developing. This is the so-called recrystallization phenomenon, which is driven by the consumption of the stored energy. So again, by stored energy, I mean mostly the contribution of the stored dislocations. Then the grains would grow. If you stop deforming, then the grains will keep growing until the stored energy is fully consumed. And then the microstructure continues to evolve to reduce the amount of grain boundaries in the microstructure. So there, the driving force is no longer the consumption of stored energy, but the minimization or the decrease of the interfacial energy. This regime here, after the consumption of the stored energy, is referred to as the grain growth stage. For describing these phenomena, we have a number of physical laws and quantities to handle. So the grain boundary mobility is of prime importance. When a grain grows, actually the mechanism is the movement of its boundaries. So the mobility is one of the important properties, material properties we have to deal with. And then we have also to describe the driving forces I've already mentioned, which are the stored energy contribution and the contribution of grain boundary energy. So you have here the expressions of the driving force associated with the difference in dislocation density. And here the expression of the driving force, which is also called capillarity force, which is actually related to the grain boundary energy. In nickel-based superalloys, I've already mentioned that we have second phase particles which are in there in order to pin the boundaries and avoid the grains to grow too large. The interaction between a grain boundary and the second phase particles is the so-called Smith Zener pinning phenomenon, by which proceeds by actually a capillarity interaction between the particle and the boundary. So there is the Smith Zener pinning, Zener model, which allows for describing a kind of pinning pressure, which counterbalance the driving force, which breaks the boundary movement. You have here the expression. Now, if we go for a typical forging of a nickel-based superalloy, starting first in the supersolvus domain. So in the supersolvus, the second phase particles are dissolved. So we have a single phase material. Here you can recognize grains which have been deformed. This is a local misorientation map which has been obtained with EBSD, and the color is related to the orientation gradients you have at the local scale between one given point of the map or pixel of the image and its neighbors. So as you can see, you have steeper orientation gradients near to the grain boundaries. This is due to the plastic strain incompatibility. So the dislocations are preferentially stored along the boundaries, and therefore this is where the new grains will form, because they appear where the stored energy level is the highest. So indeed, if hot deformation goes far enough, then you would see new grains appearing at the former grain boundaries. And if you keep deforming or deform to higher and higher strain levels, then you would see more and more of these new grains forming and consuming the deformed matrix. This is a very classical mechanism. This is the very classical necklace dynamic recrystallization, discontinuous dynamic recrystallization, which is at play here. But I would like to draw your attention to the fact that most people concentrate on what is going on during deformation. But if you deal with industrial pieces, which are quite big, they necessarily cool down quite slowly. And so you have to also consider what happens right after the deformation, which is the so-called post-dynamic regime. So at the lab scale, we are doing also experiments where the material is heated, deformed, and then we wait for some time before quenching it. This holding time is varied so that we can also analyze the kinetics of the post-dynamic evolutions. So you have here a starting material which has basically no stored energy in it. It has been fully recrystallized. You have grains with an homogeneous orientation. Starting from these materials, which has quite large grains, if you do this path, which is drawn here, then after a short post-deformation holding time, you end up with a material with much smaller grains. So this material has actually recrystallized. And these small grains, if you have a close look to these small grains, you can see that some of them have very low internal misorientation level, and others do have internal misorientations. So actually the reason for this is that here you have two kinds of recrystallized grains. Some of them have recrystallized or are formed during deformation, during hot deformation. These are the dynamically recrystallized grains. They have internal misorientations before they appeared somewhere or at some moment during the hot deformation, and they have been further deformed. So actually they are a little bit work hardened. And others have grown after deformation during the holding time, and those ones have much lower internal misorientation levels. If you're using such high angular resolution EBSD data, you can recognize these two kinds of grains. But if you just use, I would say, conventional EBSD data with an orientation accuracy in the range of 0.5 degrees, then you would not be able to separate the two kinds of recrystallized grains. So here with these maps, I wanted to show you that the accuracy of the EBSD data regarding the orientation measurement accuracy is very important to be improved so that we can really go for fine characterization of these microstructures. All right, so here, these are, again, Inconel 718 samples, which have been submitted to such a hot deformation test. And those ones have been quenched immediately at the end of deformation. Here, immediately means experimentally as fast as possible. And on our machine, the minimum quenching delay is about 2 seconds. You have here on each of these maps the actual quenching delay or quenching time that could be achieved. In these experiments, the strain rate varies. And these are the recrystallized fraction we can measure in these deformed and quenched samples. These data include both dynamic and post-dynamic recrystallization. If we analyze the dependence of recrystallization kinetics or recrystallization fraction as a function of strain rate, it seems that the dynamic recrystallization is first going slower and slower, and then faster and faster, which is a bit surprising, but this is the result which is always reported in the literature. The explanation that has been provided for this is that if you increase strain rate, you shorten the deformation time. And the reason for getting a lower recrystallized fraction is actually that the deformation time is shorter and shorter. And here, with increasing, again, strain rate, you have another effect, which is at strain rates higher than 0.1 per second, then you have self-heating issues. So temperature is increasing during deformation. And because of the higher temperature at the end of deformation, then you accelerate again the recrystallization phenomena. So this is the explanation which sounds logical and that you can find it in the literature. But if you use now EBSD data with improved orientation measurement accuracy and separate the contributions of dynamically recrystallized grains and post-dynamically recrystallized grains, then you can actually, in this, in each recrystallized fraction value, you can separate the contribution of dynamic and post-dynamic recrystallization. This is what is done here. And then you see that dynamic recrystallization goes down steadily with increasing strain rate. So actually dynamic recrystallization occurs less and less as the deformation time is shortened, but post-dynamic recrystallization becomes faster and faster with increasing strain rate, which sounds logical because you have higher temperature due to self-heating, and also you have higher dislocation densities as a result of the higher strain rate deformation. All right. Now, this is an overview of post-dynamic recrystallization kinetics depending on the strain rate. You have 4 values here, and with increasing the quenching delay. So this is kind of an overview of the post-dynamic recrystallization kinetics. And of course, the recrystallization progresses with increasing holding time, no wonder. It also gets faster and faster with increasing the strain rate as a result of higher driving force and higher temperatures. What I would like to emphasize here is the typical times we are dealing with. So here you see that with a strain rate of 0.1 per second, which is still a reasonable value. I mean, it's not particularly fast deformation. It's typical for an hydraulic press forging, for example. You see that after deformation to a macroscopic strain level of 0.7, you end up with quite a low value or low fraction for dynamic recrystallization, but post-dynamic recrystallization completes recrystallization in less than a minute. So if you compare these typical times with the cooling times required at the industrial scale, you definitely need to consider both dynamic kinetics, dynamic recrystallization kinetics, and what happens after deformation. Even at the lab scale, if you go for example, 1 per second experiment, you see that the full recrystallization time is something like maybe 20 seconds. And so even if you have a quenching delay, which is as short as 2 seconds, actually here you already have quite a significant amount of grains which are due to post-dynamic recrystallization and not dynamic recrystallization. That's it. All right. So these phenomena in terms of mechanisms are quite simple. They can be modeled with a mean field model. By mean field model, I mean we have to model the microstructure and the recrystallization phenomena. So let's start with the modeled grain. So a modeled grain would be a sphere with a given average dislocation density value. And a microstructure is a distribution of types of grains. A type of grain is defined by 2 parameters, a given size and a given dislocation density level. So this is the kind of statistical representation of the microstructure with grain categories characterized by a size, a dislocation density, and this to this space. And you have to describe the population of each of these grain types. Then you have to make them evolve. So evolution can be due to work hardening. So there you do not change the size, you increase the dislocation density. Recovery has the opposite effect. If you have a boundary migration there, then the grain grows. If a grain grows, its dislocation density will also decrease because there is no dislocations in the volume swept by the boundary movement. And because of volume conservation, you also must have grains which decrease in size, since some of them grow, others have to shrink. That's it. These individual phenomena must be completed with the nucleation law, because we have seen that you have new grains which appear, not only the evolution of the pre-existing ones, but also the appearance of new ones. And for each of these single phenomena, we can describe them with the classical physical laws, which are very well known. It's just textbook knowledge for describing each one of these phenomena. So by combining all these equations, you can make the microstructure evolve, and then you can indeed retrieve quite a good description of the evolution of the recrystallized fraction with strain, the recrystallized grain size. Also, you can account for the effect of initial grain size. So indeed, the recrystallization kinetics are affected by the initial grain size, simply because we are dealing with the necklace discontinuous dynamic recrystallization. And since the new grains appear on the grain boundaries, on the former grain boundaries, if the initial grains are smaller, you have more grain boundaries, therefore more nucleation sites, and the recrystallization goes faster. But this doesn't change the recrystallized grain size. So all these effects are known and retrieved with such models. You can also, with the same equations, describe what's going on after hot deformation, so the post-dynamic evolution. This is what is shown here. And in addition, if you calibrate the model, if you identify the parameter values for a given, for different thermomechanical conditions, then you can also interpolate the model parameter values so that in the end you are able to model the microstructure evolution, not only for one nominal set of thermomechanical conditions, but for varied conditions, and notably at the scale of an industrial piece, you never have an homogeneous temperature and strain rate throughout the piece. So you need to have these parameters calibrated as a function of local thermomechanical conditions, so that you can calculate the microstructure evolution in any location at any location in the big piece. All right. Now, as long as you're dealing with such mechanisms which occur quite homogeneously in the microstructure, then the statistical description and the mean field models are very suitable for that. But for some phenomena, you have inhomogeneities. You have some phenomena which occur at some places, some specific places in the microstructure. And then you need to go for full feed models, which account for the topology of the microstructure, the surroundings of a given grain. Therefore, we have developed also models, a framework for numerical modeling using a finite element mesh. So this is the numerical frame which corresponds to the DGMU software, which is developed by Mark. So if you have any question or would like to get details about that, please feel free of contacting Mark. He will be very happy to answer your questions. I can describe in a few words how it works. So in these models, each grain is described with a level set function. This level set function is positive inside the grains, negative outside, so that the interface of the grain boundary is actually the ISO 0 value of the level set function. Then we need a transport equation to make this function evolve, vary, and to represent the movement of interfaces. So this is a transport equation which is used, and in this transport equation we have a velocity field here to be defined, and this is where the physics are implemented, because this velocity field describes actually the mobility of the boundary of the interface and the driving force acting on it. So here we find again the differences in start energy and the capillarity forces we have described before. So we have exactly the same physical laws in these models as what we were using before in the mean field model. In addition to this, because we are dealing with material processing with large deformations, we are using adaptative meshing techniques. Adaptative means the mesh is refined near to the interfaces where the movement should be followed or described with accuracy. And this mesh will follow the movement of the interfaces. We have spoken also about the Smith Zener pinning phenomenon, which we must handle for these materials. Actually, in the full feed in finite element framework, the Smith Zener pinning is naturally accounted for simply by imposing the contact angles of the boundary with the surface of the particle. I mean by this, we do not have in the full field models to add any additional such pinning force. The pinning force or the pinning effect is naturally described or taken into account simply by the capillarity interactions between the boundaries and the second phase particles. So we have to describe the second phase particles. For this, we can either use an experimental image and immerse it in a finite element mesh. This is what you can see on top here. Or we can generate a statistical distribution of second phase particles. This is what is done here in this 3D example. Then we can run a grain growth simulation, for example. So here you have grain boundaries, you have second phase particles, and if I can click, I can show you this. So this is the simulation of grain growth. So here, for instance, we have no stored energy. Then the microstructure is evolving only because of the capillarity effects. You can see the interaction of the second phase particles with the boundaries. And after some time, grain growth will stagnate. A kind of equilibrium is achieved because the driving force for making the boundary migrate is no longer strong enough to counterbalance the pinning forces. And this is where you end up with a limiting grain size, which is also described in the mean field model of Smith Zener. So actually, this phenomenon is used in nickel-based superalloys to control the grain size. So here you see a microstructure of a gamma-gamma prime nickel-based superalloy, which in which you see that the boundaries have stopped at the second phase particles. In such an alloy, if you increase temperature, if you go to higher and higher temperature, approaching the Solvus temperature of the second phase, then you would see, of course, the volume fraction or area fraction of the second phase particles, which goes down, and the grain size, which goes up, because as the particles dissolve, the boundaries are released and the grain growth can start again. So this has been modeled using the DGMU software. So in a simulation domain, which included initially 50,000 grains with a size of 10 microns, and with small second phase particles, which you can see better here in the zoom. So the second phase particles account for 6 per the area or area fraction, and have a size of 1 micron. And then the simulation, so I show you here a zoom of the simulation because the domain was too big. So here you see the grain size distribution as long as you have enough second phase particles, and you see that the grain size distribution of the grain growth starts and accelerates along with the dissolution of the second phase particles. So this works quite well. So Smith Zener pinning is indeed very useful, well-known, well-described, and applied notably in these alloys. But in some cases, you can find very large grains with many, I'm sorry, Evan, with many second phase particles inside the grains. So this grain has very obviously grown despite the presence of the second phase particles. So this is an example in the Inconel 718 alloy, and here you have another example of a gamma-gamma prime alloy. So actually this has been observed in many different alloys. In all these cases, the common feature was that in all these cases, you have initially stored energy in the microstructure. And actually the reason for which these grains could grow despite the Smith Zener pinning pressure is that the driving force which makes the boundary go ahead or migrate is a combination of capillarity forces and stored energy. And the stored energy term is large enough, is very easily large enough to overcome the pinning pressure. Therefore, these phenomena have a very clear dependence on the strain level, actually the stored energy level you have initially in the microstructure, with a clear dependence of the maximum grain size you can get, or you would get in the microstructure, the dependence on the stored energy level you had initially. So this could be simulated also. So here you have a very simple simulation we have made some years ago with a microstructure made of grains with second phase particles, which are these small gray features. And in this microstructure, one grain has been attributed a stored energy level very low compared to all other grains. So the red grains have stored energy, the blue ones has no stored energy, let's put it like that. And this is how the simulation works. So you see that the boundaries between two grains with a similar stored energy level are pinned by the second phase particles, but the grains which has in addition or an additional driving force due to the stored energy consumption, this one can grow while the other ones stagnate. We have also kind of calibrated another simulation based on EBSD data. With EBSD data, we can assess or approach the stored energy distribution through the orientation gradients we can measure in the ardent grains. And so in an EBSD map, you can kind of average the local misorientations you measure inside each grain and describe the average stored energy level present in the grains of the microstructure. Then this distribution has been attributed to this artificial microstructure. And the color coding here goes from blue for the low stored energy grains to red for the high stored energy grains. And this is the result of the simulation again. So you see again that for grains with similar stored energy levels, the interface does not move, while the grains which had initially low stored energy levels can grow and invade the microstructure, ending up with a very heterogeneous grain size distribution. All right. So in nickel-based superalloys, we have seen recrystallization phenomena. We have seen the role played by second phase particles. Actually, in gamma-gamma prime alloys, the gamma prime precipitates have many more kinds of interactions with recrystallization phenomena. And I like very much this picture, which is a few tens of micron square, in which you can see many different things. Here on the left, you have an ardent grain, which could not recrystallize because of the presence of a very dense precipitation. There are many small precipitates in there, and these precipitates have prevented the substructures of evolving into recrystallization nuclei. So these grains recover and do not recrystallize because of the dense precipitation state. At other places, we can retrieve the Smith Zener pinning we have spoken before, and between two recrystallized grains, you have here a boundary which has stopped at the second phase particles. This is very easy, classical. This is what we have seen before. But we see also that we can notice also that we have fine precipitates in the work ardent grains, but no one inside the recrystallized grains. So there is a mechanism by which the small precipitates which are present in the deformed matrix disappear or are dissolved or transformed into something else during while the recrystallization front goes through them. Actually, we nowadays believe that it's kind of accelerated Oswald ripening mechanism, which makes the small precipitates dissolve and make a few ones grow and form these additional type of precipitates. Another phenomenon we have seen in these alloys is no longer a simple recrystallization phenomenon, but a combined phenomenon, a phenomenon combining phase transformation and recrystallization. We call it heteroepitaxial recrystallization, and you will better see what I'm meaning on this page here. So here you have gamma prime microstructure, which is partly recrystallized. Here you have very clearly you have a primary gamma prime precipitate, a large gamma prime precipitate, which is inside a recrystallized grain. If you go to the orientation map down here, actually you can see that the precipitate has the same orientation as the matrix grain. And even the twin, which is crossing the grain, also crosses the precipitate. Actually, the mechanism which leads to this very particular configuration is the following. Before hot deformation, the material has been heat treated and then slow cooled. In the state reached after holding and slow cooling, we could find at the rim of the gamma prime precipitates some small volumes of another phase, which is actually the matrix phase, or a phase with a composition that is very, very similar to that of the matrix. And once you start deforming this system, these small volumes of the gamma-like phase start growing to produce a recrystallized grain, which embeds the pristine precipitate and which maintains the orientation of keeps the orientation of the precipitates, because at the beginning, this phase transformation mechanism or phenomenon, which occurs here, producing this small volume of gamma-like phase, actually leads to crystal orientation for the gamma-like phase, which is actually the same as that of the gamma prime precipitate. And because of the presence of this, the recrystallization in this form, this type of recrystallization begins very early during deformation, because there is no need for forming a nuclei, because the nuclei is actually already there before starting to deform. So as soon as you start deforming at very low strain levels, you would immediately see that these recrystallized grains start developing. That's it. Now I'm realizing that time is going very fast, so I will not speak of this. I've already mentioned this before, the fine precipitation in during recrystallization. We have other very special interactions between gamma prime precipitates and the recrystallization front, which leads to the formation of gamma prime precipitates, which are quite unusual in shape and orientation. But I will comment on this during the discussion if you are interested in this. And I will jump to the summary. So basically, in the summary, I wanted to emphasize a few points about the end of the lecture, where in these alloys, we have found a number of recrystallization phenomena which are actually very, which have quite strong interplay with precipitate evolution and phase transformation phenomena. And therefore, for these particular type of nickel-based superalloys, I don't think we can develop suitable recrystallization models without describing also phase transformation, concomitant phase transformation. That's it. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I will be happy to answer questions.
Thanks a lot, Nathalie, for a very comprehensive and inspiring lecture. I'm now going to stop the recording.